Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we are traveling back in time to the 1920s to learn about the Great Depression
Ooh.
from a fascinating history lesson presentation.
Okay. Yeah.
This is a period that's captivated historians and economists for, almost a century.
Yeah, it's fascinating, right?
Yeah, it really is.
So we're going to examine the causes of the Great Depression,
Mhm.
explore the impact it had on, well, everybody,
Right.
and most importantly, uncover lessons we can learn from this,
Right.
so we don't repeat those mistakes.
Avoid those pitfalls, yeah.
Exactly. Okay, so the presentation starts by discussing these things called securities.
Okay.
And it sounds kind of technical and jargony,
Right.
but really it's not that complicated.
No.
Basically, every company needs money to operate right.
Right.
So securities are basically just different ways for companies to raise that money.
It's like a financial toolbox,
Okay.
with different tools for different jobs.
I like that.
You've got equity, which is basically owning a piece of the company. Okay, so like stocks.
Exactly like stocks.
Okay.
And then you have debt, where you lend money to the company.
So that's like bonds.
Like bonds, exactly.
Okay, and I know there are other types of securities too.
Right. You've got things like options and futures,
Right,
each with their own kind of level of complexity and risk.
right. But here's what I find interesting. If these securities can be bought and sold,
Yeah.
how do we ensure that everybody's playing by the rule?
That's where regulation comes in.
Okay.
Government agencies like the SEC,
Yeah.
they basically act as the referees. They set the rules of the game,
Yeah.
and they make sure everyone is playing fair.
So they protect investors.
Exactly. You can't just start selling securities publicly without, registering with the SEC.
Gotcha. It's like a safety net for the whole system.
Exactly.
Okay. But even with those safeguards in place,
Yeah.
things can still go wrong.
Oh, absolutely.
And that leads us to the big one, the stock market crash of 1929.
Yeah.
This wasn't just like a dip in the market. This was a full-on financial earthquake.
It really shook the foundations of the global economy.
Wow.
And to understand why we have to kind of step back and understand how the stock market works.
All right.
Think of it like a giant auction, where people are buying and selling pieces of companies, and those prices are constantly fluctuating based on, the company's perceived value.
So it's all about supply and demand.
Yeah.
But I feel like there's also this element of psychology involved, right?
Oh,
And presentation mentions something called investor sentiment.
Right.
What does that even mean?
Well, think about it this way.
Okay.
How optimistic or pessimistic investors are feeling,
Right.
can have a huge impact on stock prices.
Okay.
If everyone's feeling bullish, prices tend to go up.
Mm-hmm.
But if fear takes hold,
Yeah.
then that can trigger a sell-off.
Driving prices down.
Exactly. And back then, information wasn't as readily available.
Right.
So rumors and speculation could spread like wildfire.
It sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It can be.
The presentation really emphasizes that investing in the stock market always carries some degree of risk, even the potential for losing your initial investment.
Absolutely. Which is why diversification is so important.
Right. Don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Exactly. Spread your investments across, different companies and sectors.
To mitigate your risk.
Exactly.
Okay, so leading up to the crash, the presentation tells us that stock prices peaked in September of 1929.
Right.
What happened next?
Well, things started to slide, and then the slide turned into a free fall.
Oh.
Two key events really stand out. Black Thursday on October 24th,
Oh.
and then Black Tuesday on October 29th.
Wow.
These were days of just utter panic.
So investors are seeing their, portfolios shrink,
Right. They're fearing they're going to lose everything, so they start frantically selling off their stocks.
further driving prices down.
Exactly. This vicious cycle.
It sounds chaotic.
What?
Did anybody see this coming?
Well, there were definitely warning signs. But the Roaring Twenties were a time of great optimism, even exuberance.
Right.
People were making money hand over fist in the stock market, and it seemed like the good times would never end.
Right.
But beneath the surface, there were cracks in the foundation.
So the presentation points to two main culprits that contributed to the crash.
Okay.
Rampant speculation and something called margin buying.
Right. So speculation was running rampant.
Mm-hmm.
People were buying stocks not based on, a company's actual value or its potential for growth,
Right.
but simply on the belief that the price would keep going up.
So it was all about making a quick buck?
Yeah, it was like a giant game of musical chairs, everyone hoping to cash out before the music stopped.
Oh, I see.
And then you had margin buying, which really amplified the potential for disaster.
Okay, so explain margin buying.
So margin buying is essentially borrowing money from your broker to purchase stocks.
Okay.
It's like using leverage to amplify your gains, but it also magnifies your losses.
Right, so if the stock goes up,
You make more money.
but if it goes down.
You lose more. Gotcha.
And the problem was, back then, there were very few regulations surrounding margin buying.
Oh.
People could buy stocks with very little money down, which meant they were essentially betting with borrowed money.
Oh, so they were over-leveraged.
Exactly.
And when the market started to decline.
It triggered a cascade of margin calls.
Oh, no.
Brokers demanded that investors repay their loans,
Oh.
forcing them to sell their stocks, which of course drove prices down even further.
So it just spiraled out of control.
Vicious cycle.
And to make matters worse, the Federal Reserve, in an attempt to curb speculation, decided to raise interest rates,
Right.
which made it even more expensive to borrow money,
Exactly.
squeezing investors even further.
And exacerbating the downward pressure on stock prices.
So you've got excessive speculation, risky margin buying, and the Fed tightening monetary policy.
Right.
All these things coming together to create this perfect storm
Yeah.
that culminated in the stock market crash.
A perfect storm.
But the story doesn't end there.
No, it doesn't. This crash had ripple effects that spread throughout the entire financial system, leading to something the presentation calls bank runs.
Wow.
I've heard that term before, but what does it actually mean?
So imagine you hear a rumor that your bank is in trouble.
Okay.
Maybe they invested heavily in the stock market and lost big.
Makes sense.
So naturally you panic
Right?
and you rush to the bank to withdraw all your savings.
Get my money out of there.
But you're not alone.
Oh, no.
Thousands of other depositors are having the same fear,
Yeah.
creating a stampede to get their money out before the bank collapses.
And that's precisely what happened during the Great Depression.
Yes, bank runs became a self-fulfilling prophecy.
How so?
As more and more people withdraw their funds, banks deplete their cash reserves, fueling further panic and withdrawals.
So it's this vicious cycle of fear
It can-
and financial instability.
It was a very dark time.
So people are losing their savings, businesses are going bankrupt, unemployment is skyrocketing. Just how bad did things get for everyday Americans during the Great Depression?
Well, the presentation paints a pretty bleak picture. Unemployment reached a staggering 25%,
Wow.
which meant that roughly 15 million Americans were out of work.
25%. That's hard to even fathom.
It was a dark time.
Mm-hmm.
Even those who managed to keep their jobs faced drastic pay cuts and reduced hours.
Wow. What was the impact on, families and communities?
Devastating millions lost their homes and were forced to live in shanty towns that were grimly nicknamed Hoovervilles.
Hoovervilles.
After President Hoover, who many blamed for the crisis, food was scarce, bread lines stretched for blocks as people desperately sought, just a meager meal.
It's heartbreaking to think about.
Malnutrition became a serious problem, especially for children.
The presentation specifically mentions health consequences like rickets and pellagra.
Right, those are diseases caused by severe vitamin deficiencies, and they became alarmingly common during the Depression. Children were especially vulnerable, suffering from stunted growth and, long-term health problems.
Right.
And the psychological toll was immense. People lost their sense of hope, their dignity, their faith in the system.
It's a stark reminder that economic downturns don't just impact our wallets.
No, they don't.
They affect our entire well-being.
Our entire well-being, exactly. The presentation also highlights the plight of farmers during this time.
Right. How were they impacted?
Farmers were hit particularly hard. They faced a double whammy of falling crop prices and devastating droughts that turned fertile land into dust bowls.
The Dust Bowl.
Many farmers lost their farms and livelihoods, forced to migrate in search of work.
So we've got widespread unemployment, poverty, hunger, and social unrest. It's hard to imagine how America even began to recover from such a devastating crisis.
It was a long and arduous process, and it's still debated by historians today.
Right.
The presentation mentioned several factors that contributed to the eventual recovery, but I think it's important to highlight that it wasn't a single solution,
Okay.
but rather a combination of factors that gradually turned the tide.
What were some of the key turning points?
One of the most significant developments was the election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1932.
FDR.
Roosevelt ushered in the New Deal, a series of programs and reforms designed to provide relief, recovery, and reform.
I've heard of the New Deal, but I'll admit my knowledge is pretty limited. What were some of the key aspects of this program?
It was a truly ambitious undertaking, aiming to tackle the crisis on multiple fronts. For example, the Civilian Conservation Corps, The CCC put young men to work on conservation projects, planting trees, building trails, developing parks,
Oh, it's giving people jobs.
providing jobs and income for millions while also improving our nation's infrastructure.
It sounds like a win-win both for the economy and the environment.
Exactly. And then you have programs like the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, which employed millions of Americans in construction projects, building schools, hospitals, bridges, roads.
Wow.
The WPA also funded artistic endeavors, employing writers, musicians, and artists, which helped to preserve our cultural heritage during a time of great hardship.
So the New Deal was about creating jobs, stimulating the economy, but it also addressed the need for social safety nets, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
One of the most enduring legacies of the New Deal is the Social Security Act of 1935.
Social Security.
This groundbreaking legislation established a system of social insurance, providing retirement benefits, unemployment compensation, and aid to families with dependent children.
Social Security was a revolutionary idea at the time, wasn't it?
It was.
Yeah.
It fundamentally changed the role of government in providing for the well-being of its citizens.
Right. It recognized that the government had a responsibility to help people.
Exactly. And the impact of Social Security, both in terms of reducing poverty and providing financial security for the elderly, has been profound and continues to this day.
It's amazing to think how these programs, born out of the depths of the Great Depression, continue to shape our lives today.
It is.
So we've talked about the New Deal, but World War II also played a significant role in America's economic recovery, right?
Yes. The war effort mobilized the entire nation, creating a surge in industrial production and a dramatic decrease in unemployment.
Okay.
Factories were retooled to produce tanks, planes, ships, and munitions, and millions of Americans, both men and women, joined the workforce to support the war effort.
It's a reminder that as tragic as war is, it can have unexpected economic consequences.
Indeed. And after the war, there was this surge of optimism in consumer spending, fueled in part by the GI Bill,
Okay.
which provided educational and housing benefits for returning veterans.
Right.
This helped to create a more educated workforce and spurred economic growth.
So we've seen how government intervention, social welfare programs, and wartime mobilization all played a part in lifting America out of the Great Depression. What lasting lessons can we draw from this experience?
Well, the presentation does a good job of highlighting some key takeaways.
What are they?
One of the most important lessons is the need for financial regulation to prevent excessive speculation and risky lending practices.
Like we saw with margin buying.
Exactly. The Great Depression showed us what can happen when markets are left unchecked and greed runs rampant.
It's like needing a referee to ensure that everyone's playing by the rules.
Exactly.
Uh-huh.
Another key lesson is the importance of having a diversified economy that's not overly reliant on a single sector.
Okay.
The collapse of the agricultural sector during the Dust Bowl exacerbated the Depression.
Right.
A more diverse economy with a range of industries is more resilient to shocks and downturns.
Makes sense. We also see how crucial social safety nets are, especially during times of economic hardship.
Absolutely.
Programs like Social Security and unemployment insurance can provide a lifeline for individuals and families struggling to make ends meet.
It's about creating a more humane and equitable society.
Exactly. And finally, the Great Depression underscored the importance of government intervention in stabilizing the economy and promoting recovery.
Right.
The New Deal demonstrated that targeted government spending and public works projects can create jobs, stimulate demand, and help to get the economy back on track. So, in essence, the Great Depression taught us about the importance of regulation diversification, social safety nets, and targeted government intervention. But these lessons are still relevant today, aren't they?
Absolutely. The echoes of the Great Depression can be heard in the way we approach economic policy, financial regulation, and social welfare programs.
It's a reminder that history can offer valuable lessons if we're willing to learn from them.
Exactly.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. From the roaring 20s to the depths of despair and the long road to recovery, the Great Depression is a period that continues to fascinate and inform our understanding of economics and society.
It's a reminder of the fragility of our economic systems and the human cost of economic collapse.
Yeah.
But it also showcases the resilience of the human spirit
Okay.
and our capacity for innovation and collective action in the face of adversity.
And with that, I think it's time to shift our focus to the presentation's final slide, which centers around class discussion and poses some thought-provoking questions that I think are just as relevant today as they were back then. Okay, so the presentation wraps up with some questions for class discussion.
Okay.
And the first one asks, what were the main causes of the Great Depression and could it have been prevented? And I feel like we've already sort of,
We've touched on that.
Yeah, we've explored that, haven't we?
We've seen how, this confluence of factors, unchecked speculation, excessive debt, crushable monetary policy,
Right.
all of these things kind of created this perfect storm that led to the crash.
Yeah.
Whether it could have been entirely prevented,
Right.
that's a matter of debate among historians.
Yeah.
But I think it's safe to say that certain policies could have at least mitigated the severity of the downturn.
Yeah, it's fascinating to think about those what-if scenarios. Like,
Oh.
what if, there had been stricter regulations on margin buying?
Or if the Federal Reserve had acted differently.
Exactly right. History doesn't offer do-overs,
No, it doesn't.
but it does provide, valuable insights for the future.
Absolutely.
The next question asks, how did the Great Depression affect the lives of ordinary Americans, and what coping mechanisms did they develop?
Yeah.
And we've talked about the devastating impact on, families, farmers, communities.
Right.
But the presentation doesn't really delve into specific coping mechanisms.
No, it doesn't.
But it's clear that people found ways to survive,
Oh, absolutely.
to help each other,
Yeah.
and to maintain some sense of hope amidst all the despair.
The human spirit is resilient.
Yeah. Yeah.
People found ways they bartered goods and services. They
Mhm.
formed mutual aid societies.
Right.
Americans displayed remarkable resilience and ingenuity.
Yeah, there's something inspiring about that,
Yeah.
Even in the darkest of times,
Mhm.
we find a way.
We find a way.
The presentation then goes on to ask about the New Deal
Okay.
and its effectiveness in addressing the problems of the Great Depression. And we've discussed, some of the key New Deal programs,
Mhm.
but it's such a vast and complex topic. I feel like we could do a whole deep dive just on that.
Oh, absolutely.
The New Deal was truly a watershed moment in American history.
It was.
I mean, it marked a significant expansion of the federal government's role in the economy and in social welfare.
Yeah. And while its effectiveness is still debated today,
Right.
there's no denying that it had a profound and lasting impact on American society.
It's interesting how those debates continue to this day.
They do.
Like what is the appropriate role of government in addressing these kinds of crises?
Right.
How do we balance individual responsibility with collective action?
Tough questions.
Right, and these are questions that we're still grappling with even now.
Yeah, absolutely. The Great Depression really forced America to confront these fundamental questions.
Yeah.
And to rethink its approach to economic and social policy.
It challenged these long-held assumptions about, capitalism,
Right.
the role of government.
The relationship between the individual and society.
Exactly. And that leads us to the final and perhaps most important question posed by the presentation.
Okay.
What lessons can we learn from the Great Depression to prevent similar economic crises in the future?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is, right.
And it's a question that should be at the forefront of our minds.
Especially now.
Especially now as we navigate this increasingly complex and interconnected global economy.
Right.
The lessons of the Great Depression.
Yeah.
The need for financial regulation, a diversified economy, responsible debt management.
A robust social safety net.
All of these things are as relevant today as they were back then.
It's like studying a historical roadmap,
Yeah.
Trying to identify the pitfalls and the wrong turns that led to disaster so that we can chart a better course for the future
The Great Depression really serves as a stark reminder
of what can happen.
of what can happen when greed and speculation run rampant,
Yeah.
when debt burdens become unsustainable, and when we fail to provide adequate support for the most vulnerable members of our society.
It's a cautionary tale,
It is.
but it's also a story of resilience,
Absolutely.
innovation, and ultimately recovery.
Yeah.
It shows us that even in the face of, immense challenges, we have the capacity to learn,
To adapt.
to adapt, and to build a better future.
And that's what I find so compelling about studying history.
Mhm.
It's not just about understanding the past.
Right.
It's about using that knowledge to inform our present and to shape a more just and equitable future.
Well said. As we wrap up this deep dive into the Great Depression,
Yeah.
I'm left with a sense of awe,
Mhm.
at the human capacity for both triumph and tragedy.
It's quite a story.
It is. It's a reminder that we're all part of this interconnected web,
Yeah.
and that our actions, both individually and collectively, have far-reaching consequences.
It's a reminder that history isn't just something that happened in the past.
Right.
It's a living, breathing force that continues to shape our world today.
So to our listeners, we encourage you to delve deeper into this fascinating period in history,
Yeah.
to explore the stories of those who lived through it, and to reflect on the enduring lessons it offers.
Because by understanding the past
We can better navigate the present.
and build a more sustainable and just future for all.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.